You're back with The Nation. Well, with just 1 week to go before Australia goes to the polls, a Tony Abbott-led coalition government looks almost certain. Abbott's probably best known here for his frequent media gaffes and his fondness for speedos. But clearly there's more to the man who will be tasked with tackling Australia's faltering economy. Suze Metherell spent some time with Abbott on the campaign trail and found out about his strong ties to this country.
Okay, so where are we off to?
Early morning in former Australian Prime Minister John Howard's old Sydney seat of Bennelong. Liberal leader Tony Abbott is on friendly turf.
Welcome, Tony. We've got some high fives with some stars because you're a star.
You'll win. It's successful. Thank you so much. Good on you. Thanks so much. Tony Abbott.
The Liberals are ahead in the polls, but nothing's being taken for granted. It's a highly disciplined campaign, carefully planned and all about Abbott.
Let's do a selfie, eh?
Especially here, in the battleground of Western Sydney. Marginal seats where Labor support is flagging.
How are you? Sorry about the crush. It's a bit hard to get around at the moment. Good to see you too.
But it's Tony Abbott after all, and his gaffes have caused some hiccups along the way. On an earlier trip to Western Sydney, he made these comments about the local candidate.
They're feisty. I think I can probably say have a bit of sex appeal.
It caused a stir in the media, but Abbott knew he was on safe ground among the Westies.
And at the risk of exciting anyone, can I just say, obviously from that answer, she ain't just a pretty face, okay?
There's no need to apologise for what is an absolute charming compliment between friends. So, look, I think it's a sad day when a man cannot compliment a woman in what is a charming compliment.
Some critics call him old-fashioned. Harsher ones are sexist. And it's a problem when it comes to women voters. This is Manly, part of Abbott's upmarket North Shore electorate.
Do you like Tony Abbott?
Not at all. I think he's a real man of his generation.
No, it's not true. That's all the Labor Party's spin machine, try to portray he's negative or sexist because he's got daughters, he's got a wife. How to be sexist, you know?
So just who is Tony Abbott? Tony Abbott grew up here in affluent North Sydney, and his background is typical of that. He went to private Catholic boys' school and on to the University of Sydney, where he did law and economics. He supports union, not league. A conservative by instinct, perhaps. But is there more to Tony Abbott than that? Abbott's parents were Australian, but he was born in London. The family returned home when Abbott was a toddler. He went to this Catholic school in the wealthy suburb of Riverview. At university, he got involved in student politics. A Rhodes Scholar, he got blues for rugby and boxing at Oxford. He returned to Sydney and started studies to become a Catholic priest, but left after 3 years, deciding it was no longer his vocation. Father Frank Brennan is a Jesuit priest and a professor of law at the Australian Catholic University.
Tony Abbott is a religious man, he's a conservative man, he's a family man, and I think his church matters to him.
Good Catholic or not, Abbott also believed he'd fathered a child while he was at university, who was adopted out. But a few years ago, DNA tests showed he wasn't the father.
How are you keeping? Good to see you.
Father Brennan says Abbott is a pragmatic Catholic.
For example, once I went to see him about the Iraq War in 2003. He was a very senior minister in the Howard government. The Howard government at that time was deciding to join the US alliance, and I raised with him what Pope John Paul II had said about the war, who was very opposed to it. And Tony basically said to me, well, of course he would say that, because he's got to say that, he's the Pope. But if he weren't the Pope, he wouldn't be saying that.
Abbott married Margie Aitken, a Kiwi girl from Wainuiomata, and they went on to have 3 daughters together.
Tony Abbott, how are you? Good to see you.
He worked as a journalist at the Bulletin and the Australian and spent time as a concrete plant manager. Then in 1990 he became press secretary to Liberal leader John Hewson, who failed in his attempt to introduce New Zealand-style economic reforms into Australia.
This election was a referendum in the end on the GST.
The pair had their differences, but Tom Switzer, editor of the Australian edition of The Spectator, says the right can still claim Abbott as one of their own.
Whereas Tony Abbott is very much paternalistic has no qualms with the government playing a prominent role in society and the economy. But I would label him as comfortably, nevertheless, in the centre-right mainstream, very much a John Howard Liberal.
John Howard liked Abbott, not least because of his staunch support for the monarchy. After the Hewson loss, Howard sponsored Abbott to become an MP in 1994.
And you've heard your party written off. I want to say to the rank and file of the Liberal Party, you have endured far too many years in the political wilderness.
2 years later, Howard became Prime Minister, and Abbott quickly rose to the cabinet, becoming one of Howard's closest allies. Terry Barnes was a senior policy advisor to Abbott during his 4 years as Health Minister.
I think, like all good Kiwis, Margie Abbott keeps him well grounded. I think that New Zealand connection has certainly been part of his family DNA, but I think also Tony is a mad, keen rugby fanatic, and there's nothing more that warms his blood than the Trans-Tasman rivalry when it comes to the Bledisloe Cup.
A keen student of history, Barnes believes Abbott will look to New Zealand on many issues, and race relations will be one.
We only have to look across the Tasman, Madam Speaker, to see how it all could have been done so much better. Thanks to the Treaty of Waitangi, in New Zealand, two peoples became one nation.
Former sparring partner and former Labor Party President Warren Mundine is now a supporter. The Aboriginal leader believes Abbott has what it takes to make a difference to his people.
Thanks so much.
There's no doubt on public record of saying I didn't like the bloke. I didn't like his politics. I found him very conservative, very, to me, backward thinking in his area, in this area especially, Indigenous affairs. But over a period of 4 to 5 years and conversations and that, we've built a very good working relationship, and we've built a very good relationship in the way we feel about how Indigenous affairs in Australia should operate.
The Australian society has changed in a big way in the last 20, 30, 40 years, and I think he's actually more attuned to it than his critics and his opposition give him credit.
Tony Abbott has promised Mundine a role as advisor on Aboriginal affairs.
It's interesting how Canada and New Zealand, especially New Zealand, that went through the treaty process and how to do that, how to work with their Maori population, and that in Australia we went the opposite. So and also it's about how they did the commercial setups, how they operate in a commercial world and stuff like that. There are great lessons that we can learn from it. Also academia, you see Maori across politics, across the private sector, the commercial business world, across the academic world, and that in New Zealand, to an extent that you don't see in Australia.
But for most Australians, this election is about hip pocket issues. And Australian businesses are concerned they are increasingly becoming uncompetitive in the international marketplace. They want industrial reform. Senior Howard Government Minister Peter Reith.
You've got to understand, Australia's sort of back in the days of arbitration, which I'd have to say the New Zealanders sensibly dumped, in the days of Ruth Richardson a long time ago. So there's a hell of a lot of work to be done on IR in Australia.
Reith says this election is about who can manage the economy best.
We need more investment, we need more jobs, we need more opportunities for growth.
Now, how do you run a modern economy? And whether it's tax, where you're trying to get tax rates down, broaden the base, improve compliance, whether it's in the labour market, more flexibility. They're neither new ideas, they're not old ideas, they are standard ideas around the world, and Australians can look to New Zealand and say, well, you've got a much more flexible labour market than us.
In a week, Australia will vote, and it will become clear whether Abbott and the Liberal Party have convinced Australians he's more than Howard Mark II, the Mad Monk, or the budgie smuggler wearing sexist his detractors would paint him as. But there's little question, even from this former Labor Party president, that he's already been one of Australia's most successful politicians.
There's a few obstacles around, aren't there?
Whether you like him or hate him, and I used to hate him, and now I like him, is that he has been one of the most successful opposition leaders in the history. He's knocked off 3 prime ministers. Now, two, and one's resurrected himself, but I predict he'll probably knock him off again, is that he, he's incredible. And I think that people will be very surprised. I predict that he is almost he could become a Menzies in terms of his length of time as the Prime Minister of Australia.
He doesn't want to change things dramatically. His big argument is if it's broke, fix it, but if it's not broken, don't fix it.
Look, he's his own man, there's no question about that. In the end, Tony will call the shots.
He's somebody who will go out and do the best he possibly can, and he won't die wondering.
Terry Barnes, former Abbott staff member, ending that report from Suze Metherell. The story was edited by Hitendra Patel.